Happy to be with you virtually. We didn't go because traveling these days has become extremely tedious and nightmarish because we are in the peaks of fascism, which I think it makes sense. So we wanted to maybe start in this kind of short presentation because it's not about us, right? It's about community and not reading collectively. We wanted to share with you a very short introduction of what Loudreaders is for us, and also in a way to help you understand the setting where you are in now, and why the Loudreaders that we invited, to be with us for these Loudreaders in Nueva Yol. And you are basically in this sort of sound hanging just behind you, where there are diagrams and collages and papier-mâché fruits, and this is part of what we call the post-colonial propaganda that we are always working with, trying to question the images of the settler colonial imaginary and create other forms of counter-propaganda, in order to recruit people, right? Like to share literature, to share ideas, to share strategies of world making, including the drawings that are in the wall. There are a couple of the diagrams that we're going to be talking about, right? So this is a setting of what we call a loud reading room in the academy, and this is going to kind of set the framework for what Loudreaders is. And for those of you that haven't heard of Loudreaders before, Loudreaders is it borrows its name from the tobacco factories of the Caribbean, where workers who were denied any means of formal education, that they didn't know how to read, and would pick one of their own to read for them during the entire workday. And as the practice of loud reading that started reading classics became politicized by people like Luisa Capetillo, that would not only loud read Marx and Engels and Kropotkin and Bakunin, anarchist and communist works, but also would loud read her own utopian fictions where workers would rob banks and live happily ever after in the countryside, eating delicious vegetarian meals, and also where they would produce works together with the workers in the factories, right? So this is really important, an idea of collective world making. Bringing this also because to understand, what does it mean to be a loud reader, right? What does it mean to be somebody that's challenging the status quo, in the own history of New York, with the Puerto Rican diasporas, the relationship, of those kind of anti-colonial, anti-racist, anti-patriarchal, trans-feminist activists. And so it weaves into that history, right? Like moving away from the canon of white supremacy and trying to find other manifestos, right? So Loudreaders exist online, so you can go to loudreaders.com and find many presentations and lectures for free, right? It's always an open access archive, including the presentation of the anti-fascist architecture book that is the most recent Loudreaders, that Dan and Andrew and Lane generously shared with us. And you can also join us in person, right? We have our Loudreader session. We have one in January in Puerto Rico. These are some of the images, and we're going to have one in 2028. So we are launching you an invitation to join us when we do the next session, right? So it's this ongoing school, working with the land, working with the networks of solidarity, working across disciplines or against disciplines, right? Against disciplinary silos. And as an introduction, I'm Cruz Garcia.
I'm Natalie Fiampowski.
And then the Marisa Hicks, right? And this, we're gonna show you some clips of some of the drawings that are behind you, and it's gonna be connected to a bit of the narrative, right? Who we are. We're part of many collectives, right? Like a small collective of us as a family, a bigger collective as Christopher mentioned, of Opus Nobis, with Christopher and Rose, but also with Ophelia, Coco, Hilary, Holly, Luis Otoniel, Rosa, right? And it really influences everything we do, especially when it comes to this counter-colonial propaganda, especially when it comes to the practice of loud reading. Some of the images that you also see behind were co-produced by collective, and some of the maps that are mapping these networks of solidarity with the people that we're working with, across disciplines, across media, right? And again, you can find all these online, and LOUDREADERS is Afro, queer, lesbian, transfeminist, diasporic, Caribbean, Latin American, anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, anti-patriarchal, anti-fascist, collective, emancipatory, anti-ableist, solidary, and so on and so forth, right? And now with the specific diagrams, we're gonna loud read like 3 or 4 short parts of some text by Frantz Fanon, Aimé Césaire, and Suzanne Césaire, and this document that Emma has. She's gonna close the loud reading. And we want to contextualize the work, right? And I think like that's what we hope also is gonna be followed, you know, what Dan and Rose are gonna be sharing, and Christopher are gonna be sharing with us. So the first one is we're working in our Spanish edition of the Manual of Anti-Racist Architecture Education, and we wanted to read this just to contextualize, you know, the times in which we're in. We propose that precisely during moments of supremacist aggression, anti-racist pedagogy takes on its greatest urgency as a practice of survival and resistance, justice. Racial, social, and epistemic benefits us all. It is not a luxury reserved for times of professional comfort. On the contrary, it is the condition of possibility for any habitable future. Even under siege, or precisely when we are under siege, we must seek ways to implement radically inclusive pedagogical practices, not because they are politically welcome, but because they are ethically necessary and epistemologically honest and rigorous. Now, about the boomerang effect, there is another of the drawings that is behind you, and this is a quote by Aimé Césaire. And then one fine day, the bourgeoisie is awakened by a terrific boomerang effect. The Gestapos are busy, the prisons fill up, the torturers standing around, the racks invent refined disgust. People are surprised, they become indignant, they say, how strange. But never mind, it's necessary, it will pass. And they wait, and they hope, and they hide the truth from themselves. That it is barbarism, the supreme barbarism, the crowning barbarism, that sum up all the daily barbarisms. That is Nazism, yes, but that before they were its victims, they were its accomplices, that they tolerated the Nazism before it was inflicted on them, that they assaulted, shut their eyes to it, legitimized it, because until then, it had only been applied to non-European peoples, that they have cultivated that Nazism, that they are responsible for it, and that before engulfing the whole edifice of Western Christian civilization in its reddened waters, it oozes, seeps, and trickles from every crack. And that is the great thing I hold against pseudo-humanism, that for too long it has diminished the rights of men, that its concept of those rights has been and still is narrow and fragmentary, incomplete and biased, all things considered, sordidly racist. Right. Now about this chronocartography of supremacist regimes. First, we must study how colonization works to decivilize the colonizer, to brutalize him in the true sense of the word, to degrade him, to awaken him to buried instincts, to covetousness, violence, race, hatred, and moral relativism. And we must show that each time a head is cut off, or an eye put out in Vietnam and in France, they affect the fact. Each time a little girl is raped, and in France they accept the fact. Each time a Madagascar is tortured, and in France they accept the fact. Civilization, I mean, we can say US instead of France, of course. Civilization acquires another dead weight, a universal repression takes place, a gangrene sets in, a center of infection begins to spread, and that at the end of all these treaties that have been violated, all these lies that have been propagated, all these punitive expeditions that have been tolerated, all these prisoners who have been tied up and interrogated, all these patriots who have been tortured, at the end of all the racial pride that has been encouraged, all the boastfulness that has been displayed, a poison has been distilled into the veins of Europe and the West, and slowly but surely the continent proceeds towards savagery.
Jour nocturne, nuit diurne, qu'exulte la plénitude. Ah, le dernier des derniers soleils tombe. Où se couchera-t-il, sinon en moi? À mesure que se mourait toute chose, je me suis élargie comme le monde, et ma conscience plus large que la mer. Dernier soleil, j'éclate. Je suis le feu, je suis la mer. Le monde se défait, mais je suis monde. La fin disons-nous. And this was an extract of Les Purs Sangs par Aimé Césaire. And I will follow by also a text, and I will also read it in original language, written by Suzanne Césaire. So they were both also very important in the also foundation of issue, for example, called Tropic. And I invite everybody to follow on the text, the English translation. Les balisiers et les fleurs d'Absalon saignent sur les abîmes, et la beauté du paysage tropical monte à la tête des poètes qui passent. Par-delà les balancements des palmes grillagées, ils voient l'incendie antillais rouler sur la mer Caraïbe, qui est une tranquille mer de lave. Ici, la vie s'allume d'un feu végétal. Ici, sur ces terres chaudes qui gardent vivantes des espèces géologiques, la plante fixe, passion et sang dans son architecture primitive, les sonneries inquiétantes sourdes brusquement des reins chaotiques des danseurs. Ici, les lianes tropicales aux balancements vertigineux prennent des poses éthérées pour charmer les précipices et du bout de leurs doigts tremblants s'accrochent à l'insaisissable rafale cosmique qui monte tout au long des nuits des tambours. Ici, les poètes sentent chavirer leur tête et respirant l'odeur fraîche des ravines, ils prennent possession de la guirlande des îles. Ils écoutent le bruit de l'eau autour des îles et ils voient les flammes tropicales s'allumer non plus en balisier, aux gerberas, aux hibiscus, aux bougainvilliers, aux flamboyants, mais aux fins, aux peurs, aux haines, à la férocité qui brûle au creux des mornes.
She used to tell Ladybug as a find necessary her dad always wanted to guard her. But she said, no, Dad, I don't need to go to school. No, stay here, I want to guard you. Then she picks up a ladybug, and the ladybug bites the dad. As long as they find out how the ladybug bites the dad, they took her to a emissary. The emissary helped her, the ladybug don't bite, and then he started biting everybody in Hawaii world. He started writing it. Firefly King, come and find a little girl and said, come here, I can take you out for a walk. And he took her a walk and the moon was falling down the river. Then they went walking with the moon onto the river, on the river. Swimming on the ladybug. Finding the little seeds that fall out, and then they picked them up, put them in a tree, hold on a lovely apple tree, and then the storm came up. Everybody had to run away.
Maybe.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming. We've been encouraged to stand here as part of the exhibition. I am going to read a section of the essay Venice in Two Acts. It's an essay by Saidiya Hartman. And in this essay, she talks to us about the figure of Venus. Venus as a woman who appears in the archives as a dead girl, right? And that's it. That's all that is mentioned in the archives, in the slavery archives. In the essay, Saidiya Hartman also wrestles with the frustration of how the archive can never tell the full story of the enslaved, of the captive. And she utilizes the method of critical fabulation as a way to create a counter-narrative that tells a fuller story of these people that appear in the archives. Is it possible to exceed or negotiate the constitutive limits of the archive by advancing a series of speculative arguments and exploiting the capacities of the subjunctive, a grammatical mood that expresses doubts, wishes, and possibilities, in fashioning a narrative which is based upon archival research? And by that I mean a critical reading of the archive that mimes the figurative dimensions of history. I intended both to tell an impossible story and to amplify the impossibility of its telling. The conditional temporality of what could have been, according to Lisa Lowe, symbolizes aptly the space of a different kind of thinking, a space of productive attention to the scene of loss, a thinking with twofold attention that seeks to encompass at once the positive objects and methods of history and social science and the matters absent, entangled and unavailable by its methods. The intention here isn't anything as miraculous as recovering the lives of the enslaved or redeeming the dead, but rather laboring to paint as full a picture of the lives of the captives as possible. This double gesture can be described as straining against the limits of the archive to write a cultural history of the captive, and at the same time, enacting the impossibility of representing the lives of the captives precisely through the process of narration. The method guiding this writing practice is best described as critical fabulation. Fabula denotes the basic elements of story, the building blocks of the narrative. A fabula, according to Mick Ball, is a series of logically and chronologically related events that are caused and experienced by actors. An event is a transition from one state to another. Actors are agents that perform actions. They are not necessarily human. To act is to cause or experience an event. By playing with and rearranging the basic elements of the story, by representing the sequence of events in divergent stories and from contested points of view, I have attempted to jeopardize the status of the event, to displace the received or authorized account, and to imagine what might have happened or might have happened said or might have been done, by throwing into crisis what happened when, and by exploiting the transparency of sources as fictions of history. I wanted to make visible the production of disposable lives in the Atlantic slave trade and as well in the discipline of history, to describe the resistance of the object, if only by first imagining it and to listen to the mutters and oaths and cries of the commodity. By flattening the levels of narrative, discourse, and confusing narrator and speakers, I hope to illuminate the contested character of history, narrative, event, and fact, to topple the hierarchy of discourse, and to engulf authorized speech in the clash of voices. The outcome of this method is a recombinant narrative which loops the strands of incommensurate accounts and which weaves present, past, and future in retelling the girl's story and in narrating the time of slavery as our present. Narrative restraint, the refusal to fill in the gaps and provide closure, is a requirement of this method, as is the imperative to respect black noise, the shrieks, the moans, the nonsense, and the opacity, which are always in excess of legibility, and of the law, and which hint at and embody aspirations that are wildly utopian, derelict to capitalism and antithetical to its attendant discourse of men. The intent of this practice is not to give voice to the slave, but rather to imagine what cannot be verified, a realm of experience which is situated between two stones of death, social and corporeal death, and to reckon with the precarious lives which are visible only in the moment of their disappearance. It is an impossible writing which attempts to say which attempts to say that which resists being said, since dead girls are unable to speak. It is a history of an unrecoverable past. It is a narrative of what might have been or could have been. It is a history written with and against the archive. Admittedly, my own writing is unable to exceed the limits of the sayable dictated by the archive. It depends upon the legal records, surgeons' journals, ledgers, ship manifests, and captain's logs. And in this regard, falters before the archives, silence, and reproduces its omissions. The irreparable violence of the Atlantic slave trade resides precisely in all the stories that we cannot know and that will never be recovered. This formidable obstacle or constitutive impossibility defines the parameters of my work. And as part of my research, I've spent a bit of time in the National Archives of Puerto Rico. I'm interested in indigenous building techniques in the Caribbean. So a lot of what I'm searching for in terms of imagery is bohíos, which is the indigenous word for houses. They're found across the Caribbean, and they're described in the archive as follows. This first image, dated 1907 through 1915, the description goes, wood and palm leaf houses, in front of them various people. This next one, dated 1901, 1906, description, people sitting in front of a bohío in the area that is today Condado. Dated 1907, 1915, palm leaf house with thatched roof. Published in 1895 in the 25th Annual Report of the Bureau of American Ethnology. Description says, Negro house in Puerto Rico with walls constructed of palm leaves and roof thatch. And lastly, hut in Condado, bohío of a black race family. So as part of thinking or reflecting on Sandia Hartman's work and this idea of critical fabulation, I think this gives us a great, it expands the possibility of the stories that are told in the images that in the archive are reduced to a simple narrative, to a simple description. What are some of the stories that we can give the people in the image? Who are the people in the image? How did they build the houses? Who helped them build the houses? How did they source the materials? All the knowledge that is described or observed in the image, but yet fails to be described as part of an archive. So a really quick exercise that I do want to do, there are some notepads. If we have like 5 minutes, we'll share it through the audience. And if you can just write a couple of answers to the questions that I just gave, that would help us to expand the images in the archives that we are presenting today. I encourage this to be a group exercise. That will be best. And really only 5 minutes.
Rose, can you give me instructions so I can do it? We can do it here.
Yeah, so
See.
So come up with questions that would enrich what's happening in the image. And answer the questions.
sorry,
Which
answer.
image?
Do you see the image that we're presenting?
No, we see your face. Sí.
Yeah, basically just come up with your own story of what's happening in the image.
Just that one?
Yeah, just this one.
Yeah, I see two sisters and a mom. One of them is a daughter from a different way dad. I see one of them, another sister. Who's got a right for
Yeah, you have to make a question about that image.
And I see a neighbor going in the house. I don't know if he's doing it.
Okay, I'm gonna call that time to be respectful of everyone's time. But quickly, if anyone wants to share, that would be awesome. You already were spending the archive.
We were talking about sort of like how the house is small for the size of the family, and how maybe there's something about like the indoor-outdoor living in the community, the activities happening outside, and then sleeping quarters inside. And sort of like this, it's more about the story of the family than the description. Yeah, thank you.
So there are two sisters, a mother, a daughter from a different baby daddy, a neighbor going into the house. They're waiting for the photo to be taken because they're dressed up for possibly a special event.
There's one more in the back.
I was gonna say, it could maybe a meeting place, like a school or a church that they're also attending, or, taking a picture in front of that as well.
Thank you. I think the house looks really humble, yet the people were really, really well dressed for that time. And so I think maybe they're waiting to have a wedding ceremony or something, because there's a lady, I think she looked young, and in white, so I thought maybe she's the bride with the family and getting ready for the wedding. So one of the wedding photos.
Thank you everyone.
Really great to be among you all and to participate in this loud reading together. And it's really nice also to follow Rose's activity in loud reading on critical fabulation, because I want to think a little bit about sci-fi as well. And so I think one of the interesting things that was brought up in the study of art and text, I'm not going to remember the language quite well, was thinking a bit about the subjunctive tense. What I love about the subjunctive is that it also expresses desire. And one of the interesting things that Samuel Delaney, who I'll be loud reading from, mentions in his essay about 5,750 words, that's the actual essay title, is that sci-fi operates in the subjunctive tense. So rather than thinking about sort of the realism of things that have happened, or fantasy, things that could not happen, sci-fi thinks about things that have not yet happened. And so to kind of put our minds in this kind of future-oriented way of thinking of events that have not yet happened is one way that Samuel Delaney thinks about sci-fi. The small excerpt that I want to read is from a short story published in 1968 by Delaney, titled at the time considered as a helix of semi-precious stones. And I think everyone has some printouts that are on the chairs, and I thought that I would read this excerpt, maybe just share one or two thoughts, or more so questions that I have about it, and then end my presentation with a little bit of reading from my own work, an excerpt as well of a poem. Just maybe for context, Time Considered as a Helix of Semi-Precious Stones is one of my favorite Samuel Delaney stories. It's kind of a proto-cyberpunk story that follows a protagonist whose name is abbreviated HCE, and he's the kind of master of disguise and a thief who changes his alias every time it's needed as he's moving from one sort of context or location to the other. And I think in general the premise of the story is that HCE kind of has some very precious items fall into his hand that he needs to quickly get rid of. And he, through the story, moves from kind of being a small-time crook, we could say, to slowly kind of rising the ranks of the social hierarchy within the kind of criminal underworld. One of the interesting things about the story as well is that throughout it, he's consistently trying to evade the police. And that's in part because the police have a technology that is akin to what nowadays is called predictive policing. And so they're able to basically look into a person's past and predict, I guess, to some degree of accuracy, whether a person will commit crimes in the future or not. And I think another kind of interesting point about this story in a whole is that the authorities aren't actually that interested in bringing down the big guys or the little guys, but rather the people that are moving from little guys to big guys. And that's in part because that kind of social movement disrupts the hierarchy that's in place and the status quo with regards to how money is flowing between criminal underworld, the political class, and so forth. And so HCE, as someone who's beginning to kind of threaten this balance, is under the watchful eyes of the intergalactic police. But the part that I want to read is a short excerpt which I think defines in some ways the role of the poet. I'm a poet myself, and so this is kind of one way I want to bring in and loud read Samuel Delaney's short story in relationship to my work and practice. As part of the kind of different figures that make up the world of this short story, there's the figure of the singer, who is someone kind of like a real-time extemporaneous reporter who, when the moment strikes, decides to sing aloud what it is that they're witnessing to whoever is around. And so we get this description of the singer. Singers are people who look at things, then go and tell people what they've seen. What makes them singers is their ability to make people listen. That is the most magnificent oversimplification I can give. 86-year-old El Posado in Rio de Janeiro saw a block of tenements collapse, ran to the Avenida del Sol, and began improvising in rhyme and meter, not all that hard, in rhyme-rich Portuguese. Tears running his dusty cheeks, his voice clashing with the palm boards above the sunny street. Hundreds of people stopped to listen. 100 more, and another 100. And they told hundreds more what they had heard. 3 hours later, hundreds from among them had arrived at the scene with blankets, food, money, shovels, and more incredibly, the willingness and ability to organize themselves and work within that organization. No tri-D report of a disaster has ever produced that sort of reaction. El Posado is historically considered the first singer. The second was Miriam Ameh in the root city of Lux, who for 30 years walked through the metal streets, singing the glories of the rings of Saturn. The colonists can't look at them without aid because of the ultraviolet the rings set up. But Miriam Ameh, with her strange cataracts, each dawn walked to the edge of the city, looked, saw, and came back to sing of what she saw. All of which would have meant nothing except that during the days that she did not sing, Dragones, or once she was on a visit to another city to which her fame had spread, the Lux Stock Exchange would go down, the number of violent crimes rise. Nobody could explain it. All they could do was proclaim her singer. Why did the institution of singers come about, springing up in just about every urban center throughout the system? Some have speculated that it was a spontaneous reaction to the mass media which blanket our lives. While tri-D and radio and news tapes disperse information all over the world, they also spread a sense of alienation from first-hand experience. How many people still go to sports events or political rally with their little receivers plugged into their ears to let them know that what they see is really happening? The first singers were proclaimed by the people around them. Then there was a period where anyone could proclaim himself a singer who wanted to, and people either responded to him or laughed him into oblivion. But by the time I was left on the doorstep of somebody who didn't want me, most cities had more or less established an unofficial quota. When a position is left open today, the remaining singers choose who is going to fill it. The required talents are poetic, theatrical, as well as a certain charisma that is generated in the tensions between the personality and the publicity web a singer is immediately snared in. Before he became a singer, Hawk had gained something of a prodigious reputation with the book of poems published when he was 15. He was touring universities and giving readings, but the reputation was still small enough so that he was amazed that I had ever heard of him. That evening we encountered in Central Park. I had just spent a pleasant 30 days as a guest of the city, and it's amazing what you find in the Tombs Library. It was a few weeks after his 16th birthday. His singership was to be announced in 4 days, though he had been informed already. We sat by the lake till dawn while he weighed and pondered and agonized with the coming responsibility. 2 years later, he's still the youngest singer in 6 worlds for half a dozen years. Before becoming a singer, a person need not have been a poet, but most are either that or actors. But the roster through the system includes a longshoreman, 2 university professors, an heiress to the Silitaxinilians, tack it down with Stilitax, and at least 2 persons of such dubious background that the ever-hungry for sensation publicity machine itself has agreed not to let any of it pass the copy editors. But wherever their origins, these diverse and flamboyant living myths sang of love, of death, of the changing of seasons, social classes, governments, and the palace guard. They sang before large crowds, small crowds, to an individual laborer coming from the city stocks, on slum street corners, in club cars of commuter trains, in elegant gardens atop 12 towers, to Alex Spinell's select soiree. But it has been illegal to reproduce the songs of the singers by mechanical means, including publishing the lyrics since the institution arose, and I respect the law, I do, as only a man in my profession can. I offer the explanation then in place of Lewis's and Anne's song. And this is just following when 2 singers, Lewis and Anne, who have decided to spontaneously sing at a party that a politician is holding. And so I think, some of the parallels or similarities between loud readers and singers, the poet and a singer, are maybe kind of becoming apparent in this reading. And I think some of the questions as well that come to mind for me as a writer as well as a reader are, how might we process raw data into poetry like the singers in Delaney's story? And I want to use, the language of raw data in part because I want to also think through it in the terms of the authorities of this text who are using first-hand experience, which is also mentioned in this brief excerpt, as raw data to police, right? And so how is it that if the police are thinking about raw data, we might be able to think about it as well in order to do things other than policing, in this case, writing poetry. Another question I have is what can we say in time and other times where there are voices? And last, how will we write this, right? A couple of years ago for Loud Readers Trade School, I ran a small workshop called Loud Readers or Writers Too. And I think one of the ways in which I want to think about the act of loud reading as a poet and not an architect amongst this group of mainly architects is that writing is for everyone, and writing is something that happens when we read, and vice versa as well. And so These are questions that I don't fully have answers to, but that I want to nonetheless propose to the group here to continue thinking about. The other two things that I want to just briefly mention before I read a little bit of my own work is that I'm really enamored by the opening definition of singers in Delaney's description here. So he says, singers are people who look at things, then go and tell people what they've seen. What makes them singers is their ability to make people listen. And of course he says that's an oversimplification, but I quite like it. And so I think these are also questions that I'm taking with me. How can I go and tell people what I've seen, and how can I make people listen as well? I was realizing when I was putting this small presentation and quick presentation together that there's quite a lot of weight now on my own poetry after starting in this way. And rather than say that what I'm going to read next is kind of the answer or the solution to the questions I have, I think it's just an example of ways I've been trying to approach these questions. And so maybe now I'll take a little seat. And I'll go ahead and end the presentation with this reading. It's an excerpt from a poem called Phenakistoscope. Phenakistoscope is a sort of early animation device in which a number of images are kind of drawn or animated around a wheel that's then spun. It's supposed to give the sort of illusion of movement. Meditation doesn't work when in the hospital. Around the corner from the cleaners, Joe was vigilant. What did he think about those tacos? About Thanksgiving, even though I disliked turkey? The prompt wasn't writing a prayer, it was for everybody. Jackie worried that poets want to write from themselves, that they are spreading identity. Back in 2015, I wrote a poem about watermelon. Laura turned it into a video. Residency, aliases, mark making, money. The city comes first because not everyone has money. The plates are set, the monstera is interminable, the perfume wrong. United by surveys, genuflecting before a menu, conditions foam in a bunker reality. I close my eyes and am not a benefactor. In the kitchen, music, banda, playing. Manifestations of chasing territory once more people enter Valor. And I can't blame them. White phosphorus is verified. Did you hear about the magistrate in Aguascalientes, who the government claims slashed their own throat because they were gay? The waitress was smiling the whole time like she manages the rows of the world. And you can count from 10 backwards, slowly. But it's violent, slavish to collect meaning. Gym shorts kiss a bicycle seat. My editor writes, dead bodies of mothers and their children, political asylees and migrant workers clog the river, feels too visceral as a second sentence. But do the unthinkable before asking for permission. We aren't as far away as you think. Which leads to another dilemma. Fronton Island and life savings. Unnamed and visually untamed lands. Crossing a border, but only epistemically. The woman next to me ordering more guac. Mom home maybe thinking I'm okay. Be in a silent face. Too tart means strawberry. What to do with corpses, but transfer words like bodies. If writing were as easy as grouping the alphabet. If the day did not begin with live feet. The exposition of ego sounds like a magic flute. Western intellectualism funneling resistance into a binary, into vengeful pathologies. Freeze, one pathway is massacre, the other horrified. His poetic language, some friends were heading in a strange direction. I'm writing under the ecstasy of pain. Ceramics, a subterranean pipeline, ringing in the ears, wireless energy, eSIMs, speech bubbles, ellipses. What's important is maintaining a little order in the mess. And that's the primacy of organizing. Yale conservatism dealt with. Body with little clarity. Everyone meeting at the park at 3 p.m. Another editor says the collection also delves into the realm of object reproduction and object desire, all within a hyper-capitalist habitat, but is teeming with text and language, as much infernal as it is imprinted on the surface of the city. Majdav is writing, Thank you for remembering me. Habibi Chris. Slow, easy-going music from the Inferno elevator. To combat teaching essay writing as argumentative. The proxy of school, baptism. Since when did all those little machines start showing up in the city, asking to tap? In Bay Ridge, the businesses shut down in solidarity. The women and children are emptying onto the streets. Some people learn Arabic, others speak in Spanish and reference the Philippines. Helicopters swoop in. I know Lily would not approve, but does she? There's a tendency for people to distrust friends and crises. In my notebook, June's work list for her series, All the Ways I Hold My Baby. Title, Cumbia, Scenes of Migrant Life. Due date, 10/3. Maria's Ruin Munchen Companions public program from June to October this year. Sydney score for her lullaby about being an au pair. I guess the people that came in and out are excited about Black Friday. An upgraded Iranian hypersonic missile. Apaches carrying thermobaric bombs with meat grinder functionality among 100 meters of impact. Try to write the second you show up at my door. Kyrie Irving knows what makes up crime. The devil lies so much we'll stitch his words together to find the meaning. Is it a bell? A croissant? The students hung up on the representation of the dead body in Isabella Hamad's short story, Mr. Kanan. Looking at words together, spazzing drunk from serum with sodium bicarbonate. Fighting the guy whose radical thoughts are in his head. A hurricane's hitting Acapulco. Cockroaches are mating on the thatch. Also people talking about Congo with spite. Fanon's famous passage about violence being cleansing. Saeed's secret refutation on BBC, although what he said was the word purgatory. I think you're hearing the moon talking. In the theater of over-identification, as a ritual, the cooks in the back are calling me boss. Nearby, parties got General Chow's and shrimp boil. Line up fingers, mostly, drill authenticity as practice. Find style for paparazzi and bulletproof vests. Maybe boots, snake skins, a third eye, gumballs, Carlos Pinto, blackbirds, and terracotta pots for cactus. The world won't subsist on bread alone. Grandma's innervated. Whatever is equivalent to soul outside the house, I want. All those pretty words about the sun, but you can't wake up. The wobbly table held steady by a cigarette pack, the waiter puts down like a pro. And the sweet potato vendor's funeral whistle. When it's dark by 4 p.m. Sliman Mansour making up ground with the New Vision group. Turning to the environment, dirt's commonplace. I know, that's fucked up, I text Alexis on WhatsApp. The best torta, hands down, chicken fried steak with pickle jalapenos. 8 days, and even then, fabricated evidence won't stack. Part of me is troubled and inquisitive. Who was the kid that was shot? Like when I was young and I was construed to be liberatory, pure Satanism. The sexy ambiance of overpriced tuna. Yeah, writing's transcendental, I say, tight-lipped, loosening my grip. Coordinates zero in. Lungs collapse in a vacuum. Was telling Dad not to text back. It was spam. What's broadcasted on CNN and Fox News has changed him. I see streets lined with men threatening to kill me. They're not secret on the subway traveling beside me. How easy would it be to overfirm and overdose of reality? Heart tattoos, miso soup. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Dan Jonas Roach. I'm so honored to be here following the wonderful readings by Rose and Christopher. Thank you so much, Cruz and Natalie, for having me. I'm going to read tonight a short section of a book that I recently co-authored with Andrew Santa Lucia and Lane Rick called Anti-Fascist Architecture. This book is a manifesto for anti-fascist architecture. And I'm going to read a section of the book about a revolutionary Cuban architect named Pastorita Núñez Gonzalez. I want to give thanks to Cruz for, it was him several years ago who told me about Pastorita. And that's the reason now that she's in this book. To bring this back into the sort of the present, our book was launched on May 1st, time of May Day. Also on May 1st was the day that the Trump administration passed a new wave of sanctions on the country of Cuba, and the results have been devastating. And so, yeah, I want to dedicate this reading to Pastorita. Cuba, 2000. The sun was shining over Havana Bay when Fidel Castro wrote the following about his old friend and comrade. Pastorita Núñez Gonzalez provided extraordinary and risky services to the rebel army in the fight against tyranny, collecting taxes that amounted to the sum of several million pesos. End quote. Decades after the defeat of Fulgencio Batista's dictatorship, accomplished together with Gonzalez and the Cuban rebel army, he added, "This was outstanding work. She accomplished her mission with singular courage, efficiency, and honesty." End quote. It was the beginning of a new epoch in world history. Few people, let alone architects, lived as Pastorita Núñez Gonzalez did. After fighting as a guerrilla and later as a first lieutenant in the Cuban rebel army, the group of militants from the Sierra Maestra Mountains that tore down Cuba's US-backed fascist government, Gonzalez was appointed director at the National Savings and Housing Institute, or the INAV, a position she held from 1959 to 1962. In just 27 months, the INAV under Gonzalez's leadership built 8,533 homes in Cuba's 6 provinces. Some of Pastorita's houses were large, others were small. All were built to quickly house the new, more prosperous class of Cubans that appeared after the 1959 revolution. Today, these houses are known colloquially in Cuba as Repartos Pastorita or Pastorita's houses. They were designed to house the most humble revolutionaries. For her efforts, Irving Flom, a sympathetic journalist from the US, remarked in 1960 that next to Castro himself, Pastorita is the revolution's best-liked official. In 2000, Gonzalez was awarded the title of National Labor Hero for her unflinching commitment to the Cuban Revolution. The next year, the UN presented her with the UN Habitat Scroll of Honor Award for her contributions to architecture and society at large. Despite her mind-boggling rate of production, Gonzalez never formally studied architecture. She was an autodidact from a very poor family, who quickly taught herself the trade after taking up arms in the jungle. She created innovative solutions to building on a massive scale in a very quick time frame, on a shoestring budget, and for a very good cause. Not only that, her friends remember her as being extremely kind, warm, and humble. She lit up the room wherever she went. Pastorita was certainly an anti-fascist architect. Builder of Dreams was Pastorita Núñez Gonzalez's nickname, a fitting parallel to her longtime friend Castro's epithet, the Soldier of Ideas. Gonzalez was born on April 27, 1921. Her mother, Florinda Gonzalez Alvarez, de-stemmed tobacco for a living until she died when Pastorita was only 5 years old. Gonzalez's father, Joaquin Núñez Rodriguez, was also a worker. She grew up in destitute poverty. In 1933, Pastorita, then only 12 years old, joined her father in a popular demonstration against the dictator Gerardo Machado, thus marking the start of her political journey. It was at this demonstration that Gonzalez met Eduardo Chivas, the anti-imperialist revolutionary leader of Cuba's Orthodox Party. Many historians argue that Chivas was Cuba's precursor to Castro. He was an ardent Cuban nationalist who consistently placed his life on the line for the revolution, and he was consistently imprisoned for his efforts. While locked up in jail on Machado's direct orders, Chivas' family told his cellmate in 1931, "If I'm going to die, I want my last words to be for the Cuban Revolution. I'm a revolutionary. I love my patria and have contempt for the current regime." Castro would later say that if it weren't for Chivas' firebrand speeches to the Cuban people, the attacks on the Moncada barracks, which marked the beginning of the July 26th movement that would end in the dictatorship's defeat in 1959, would have never happened. Tragically, Chivas committed suicide in 1951, just days before a federal election in which he was a candidate. But the impact he made on young revolutionaries like Gonzalez was immutable. As a young student, Gonzalez frequented the Orthodox Party headquarters in her neighborhood, where she eventually met a teenage Fidel Alejandro Castro Ruz and forged a bond that would last a lifetime. While in her teens, Gonzalez joined the Brotherhood of Cuban Youth, where she met Cuban revolutionary Juan Manuel Marquez. Gonzalez was arrested multiple times for her revolutionary activity with the Brotherhood. In 1953, Castro and 139 other rebels launched their famous attack on the Moncada barracks, a federal garrison that stored the Batista regime's weapons. The attack was unsuccessful and dozens of the rebels were executed. Castro was imprisoned, but his life was spared thanks to his wife's political connections. He and his brother Raul were quickly forced into exile in Mexico, where they met a young Argentinian medical student, Ernesto Che Guevara, in Mexico City. The Castro brothers and Che illegally returned to Cuba in December 1956 aboard the legendary ship, the Granma. Shortly after, Pastorita joined them in the mountains, together with hundreds of other revolutionary women who had taken up arms. There she led coordinated attacks against Batista's armies in cities throughout Cuba. Her codename was Augustina. The Cuban rebel army toppled the dictatorship in 1959. 2 years after the Cuban Revolution, Castro declared himself a Marxist-Leninist. Meanwhile, Gonzalez was helping build the Women's Martí Civic Front, a group named after the poet José Martí, alongside the feminist communist Carmen Castro Porta and members of the Revolutionary Women's Union. The group's core membership also included Celia Sanchez, Heidi Santa Maria, and members of the Mariana Grajales Brigade. After the 1959 revolution, the new Cuban government abolished the national lottery system left over from Batista's regime, and in doing so did away with a cesspool of corruption. The national lottery, according to Flam, was a lucrative racket exported by Spain to its colonies. It consisted of weekly drawings where lucky numbers were drawn from a hat for the distribution of housing and other goods. The weekly drawing of lucky numbers had been one of the assured sources of graft for Cuban politicians for generations, and one of the vices of the Cuban poor, depriving infants of their nourishment and landlords of their rent, Flam wrote. Castro abolished the national lottery while he and Gonzalez were going to war with the Cuban capitalists and gangsters from the United States who owned Havana's casinos. Think of The Godfather 2 and Michael Corleone's relationship with Hyman Roth. The National Institute of Savings and Housing was established to build communities throughout the country after the national lottery was abolished. While the system was publicized as being completely meritocratic, most of the first houses went to militants from the Cuban rebel army, and only later were homes assigned to social workers, school teachers, and other public servants. Gonzalez's office, from which she ran INAV, was located at Plaza Civica. There she designed and helped build over 8,000 homes for the Cuban people. INAV produced over 80 different housing types that could be built at sites with varying topographical conditions and parameters. Under Gonzalez's leadership, INAV would become, in quote, one of the best organized, most efficiently operated, and most shrewdly publicized government institutions in Latin America, end quote. In 1960, Gonzalez invited foreign architects from around the world who were sympathetic to the Cuban Revolution to come join her. At Castro's invitation, Margaret Schulte-Lahotsky, an anti-fascist Austrian architect, traveled to Cuba in 1961 to help design children's facilities in the nascent revolutionary state. Ciudad Camilo Cienfuegos in East Havana was one of INAV's most ambitious projects. The complex was built to house 8,000 residents and 1,306 residential units spread across a 70-acre site. The prefabricated buildings range from 4 to 11 stories. The taller buildings allow for ample green areas for parks, baseball fields, etc. The complex includes a dedicated children's area, a shopping center, a sanitation hall, a social club, and 2 schools. The estate is named after Camilo Cienfuegos, a revolutionary often heralded as Castro's second-in-command, whom Gonzalez fought with in the mountains. Cienfuegos never formally declared himself a communist or an anarchist. He simply described himself as a staunch revolutionary, committed to freeing the Cuban people from the shackles of tyranny. At the 7th Congress of the International Union of Architects in Havana, Castro presented Ciudad Camilo Cienfuegos to a room full of designers and diplomats eager to see what had been brewing in Cuba since the revolution. The 1963 Congress assembled over 2,000 architects from 80 different countries, marking the UIA's first ever meeting in the Western Hemisphere. Castro told the audience, You could say these units in East Havana are ideal from our point of view because of the construction, the urban housing, but also because it is the type of construction that was beyond our economic means. Cuban architect Roberto Segre described the smaller units how the small units challenged the reductionism of the purist parallel scheme, a heritage of Ludwig Hilberstein. When Gonzalez stepped down from INAV in 1962, some 1,594 unfinished projects throughout Cuba were left in limbo. The largest unbuilt project was La Unidad Vecinal No. 2, a complex situated along Havana's Via Monumental that she had planned in collaboration with Raul Gonzalez Romero and Fernando Salinas. The unbuilt project posited 26 superblocks along this winding avenue, located not far from the 18 low-rise buildings. These towers were to be built for teachers and teaching staff, but they never materialized. INAV formally dissolved on March 31st, 1968, after operating for 6 years solely as a bank savings instrument. Ciudad Camilo Cienfuegos was declared a Cuban national monument in 1996. Personal details pertaining to Gonzalez's life are scant, but a declassified 1959 FBI office memorandum reveals some information. The unearthed document describes Gonzalez as, in quote, a lesbian, in quote, who was somehow bad for U.S. business interests and who may have been plotting to assassinate John F. Kennedy, but the one-page memo doesn't provide any specifics. Flom describes Gonzalez as a short, dark Cuban from a poor family, in quote. She started her climb by joining Castro's rebels in the Sierra Maestra Mountains at a time when girls were warmly welcomed by his young bearded warriors. Flom continues, I do know that Pastorita is tireless in promoting her bonds and houses. She has surrounded herself with a largely feminine staff of expert publicists and social workers. The former publicized not only INAV and its housing program, but also Pastorita in her appearances and speeches at dedicatory ceremonies, usually several weekly. They write the speeches which she delivers in an earthy manner that is a delight to listen to, and seemingly popular with the Cuban people. It is quite possible that next to Castro himself, Pastorita is the revolution's best-liked official. After retiring, Gonzalez spent the rest of her life surrounded by nuns in a Catholic nursing home. There she created communal social clubs for the elderly and even put her architectural training to use by repairing the colonial-era building by hand. One of her attendants, Katuska Blanco, noted that despite her old age, Pastorita woke up every day at 4 a.m. to perform calisthenics, a habit passed on to her by her working-class parents that she never shook. Katuska said she exercises every day and wastes no time. After exercising, Pastorita dedicated her time to writing. In quote, Pastorita writes and writes tirelessly, for she admits to feeling need to put in words an intimate description of her intense and beautiful experiences, end quote. After transcribing her thoughts, Pastorita would clean the house and water the plants. In her own memoir, Blanco vividly remembers Pastorita's room. It contained a death mask of her old friend Eduardo Chivas, Camilo Cienfuegos, and Che Guevara, and photos of Che Guevara and Camilo Cienfuegos in the Sierra Maestra Mountains, and a candid picture of her smiling alongside Raul Castro and his wife, Vilma. Gonzalez died in Havana on December 26, 2010, at the age of 89. Her ashes were scattered before the bust of Jose Marti in eastern Havana's Camilo Cienfuegos district at her widely attended funeral. Today, many Cubans living outside Cuba refer to their new residences as Pastoritas, as a way of finding community in the diaspora and of creating a link between old and new homes. On social media, one person summed up her experience of moving to Miami when she wrote, in quote, when we arrived here in the early 1960s, Pastorita was one of the few places that would rent to us Cuban refugees. Many other rental properties around Miami had signs that said no pets, no Cubans. The newly arrived Cubans named the complex Pastorita because it reminded them of the housing projects in Cuba that were built by Nunez. Also, it was a way to make a tough situation more tolerable.
How that research has taken shape and what has been the main objectives on looking into this still name them? I don't know much about it.
Yeah, the main objective of the research was to recognize the contributions of Black people in the Caribbean, specifically in how they contributed to the built environment. And in the research, as I was, like looking for texts, essays, academic work, I found, well, first of all, there's only a few people who specialize in this topic. So the research that has been done is like very limited. But I had the opportunity to travel to 6 Caribbean countries. And in those travels, I did a lot of interviews. The bulk of the work was focused on oral histories. Because as we saw in the archival work, there's very little information that really provides us enough information to understand the contributions of Black people in the Caribbean as it relates to architecture. The oral histories were incredibly rich. When I talk to people, I always encourage them to talk to their grandparents, talk to their parents about the way that they live, specifically if they're immigrants, because these are histories that are important to preserve. And in the way of the Bohío, also while I was doing like the research before my trip and during like the interviews, one thing that was very clear, very evident, was the relationship and the let's say the links and the relationships between indigenous and Black people. Because the Bohío, if you look through the history and the first accounts of the Spaniards when they arrived to the Americas, they described the Bohíos as the houses where indigenous people lived. But really throughout history, it was Black people who preserved the ways in which this technology, you can call it, was preserved over time.
Thank you.
I'm just curious, it's a general question for everyone here because I understand that most or all of the presenters are architects. And I wonder how the work you presented today actually informs the work that you are doing as architects or plan to do. What elements from the things that you brought to us today are you implementing into the modern ways in which you're building or designing housing? And anyone can go first.
Well, as the personnel, I can just begin us by sharing that I think in writing, I think about world building. And so, how I said with language, we can create worlds that are other than the one that we're living in that might offer alternatives to forms of life, being together that are currently not offered to us. I'm also interested in space, the urban environment, borders. And so I think with regards to thinking a little bit about Delaney and sci-fi in particular, I'm curious about the ways in which sci-fi is offering a way of thinking into the future and offering as a form of world building ways to imagine different kinds of relations and different kinds of realities even that are currently not offered to us.
I would just say this book started as a course. A lot of the people that we talk about in it started as a college course, and I think I'm a journalist. I write a lot about day-to-day happenings in New York City, but I think as the co-author of this book, I'm very interested in dismantling the ontologies that we're introduced to very young as architects. I was in architecture school over 10 years ago, and I remember being taught by professors how beautiful fascist architecture was. And, just a little bit, I had family who was killed in the Holocaust, and I just can't. This thing has been festering inside of me for years, and it's almost like I needed to write this book to convince myself that I wasn't crazy. And so now I'm very interested in hopefully this seeping more into college courses, and just we can start reconstruction that way. Starts with education.
Yeah. Oh, if they were saying that fascist architecture is so beautiful, can you give an example of what they considered to be a beautiful fascist building?
Yeah, great question. So the sort of the demigod of fascist architecture that the Ivory Tower loves is an Italian, Giuseppe Tirani. I can't even count on two hands how many books have been written about him, probably just in the last 20 years. It's been nonstop. You know, there are books fetishizing Albert Speer, who is Hitler's architect of the Third Reich, and many, many, many more. And yeah, there's this, in the book we talk about how in the early 1960s, sort of before neoliberalism had taken hold of the US and the global economy, what have you, you start to see this rehabilitation of fascist architects and artists like the filmmaker Leni Riefenstahl, a lot of other people. And it's our thesis that this rehabilitation was serving a social and an economic function as well, because fascism was being rehabilitated to sort of lay the groundwork for neoliberalism. We go into it a lot more rigorously in here, but yeah, so yeah, I hope that answers the question.
I just want to add something now, because I'm also a journalist and I interviewed them for this coming soon. I'm delayed by a month. But something that is interesting about this rehabilitation of these clear fascist figures like Speer were done by really famous, established Jewish architects too, and we were kind of like grappling about this and about how academia in America, established academia, was also doing that. And I don't know, and in your book also present these references about how also, established academia also do a lot of this washing. And I don't know if there is something from this book also that you will suggest your student to increase their critical take on these things that you would like to share also.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's something that I think about so often. I think that the reason that I think Philip Johnson is to blame for that entire sequence of thought, but like think about what when you're going through high school, whatever. Think about what a U.S. education asks of you, especially if you're not have been here for 500 years and came on the Mayflower or something. For me personally, I was taught that the people who killed my ancestors were brilliant artists, and everybody has their own relation to, these horrible things, and it just think about what the education system asks of you and how it dehumanizes you and just tries to warp you to fit into the pedagogy. And I hope that the book, gives people courage to say fuck that. Yeah.